classroom-like room.
It is a classroom.
Wait, I'm gonna sit a bit more.
Yeah, that's
Look
fine.
at you a little bit. Yeah?
All right.
Yes?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Cool.
Shall I start us off?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Simon von Saarloos, and I wrote this book, Against Ageism, a Queer Manifesto. Thanks for holding it up. And I'm very excited to be in conversation with Shuli Branson. Shuli wrote the book, The Practical Guide to Anarchism, which I very much loved. And I think she has extra copies with her.
Yeah, I have a few. If you want to buy one from me, you can.
And then more recently, Shuli's also been co-hosting the podcast, The Breakup Theory.
I got stickers if you want.
And I feel like this is like this works well. And I'm incredibly interested in the way in which Shuli is thinking about a kind of like divestment or like letting go of particular things that do not work anymore. And one of the things I would vouch to let go of would be age. And so that's why I invited Shuli as a conversation partner here today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh yeah, I was excited when you invited me, and you know, we had already been talking about the book and having a conversation, and then this came up, and I was like, yeah, this is perfect. I like the way you put it, right? Like refusing or divesting from age, because I'm very committed to ideas of like youth liberation, family abolition. Maybe we'll get into that, which I think is connected with a like working against age is defining our identity or a hierarchy of who matters. But maybe, do you want to give a little bit more of a background about the book before we like go into it?
I can do that. And we will also have time for questions afterwards. So hold on to those or interrupt us whenever. So when thinking about age or ageism, I think often the way that it is approached is that it's about the discrimination of older people. And I am approaching ageism as something that affects all of us at any age. So I think, I think we make a lot of fuss about being assigned gender at birth, and I think we should. However, I would say we're also assigned age at birth. So the moment that we come into this world and we're documented onto this timeline. And when I'm saying timeline, I'm referring to a kind of linear progressive time that then you're on. Like your development is being tracked as a baby, literally, like your physical situation, so to say. But you're also, so that's like on a kind of like bodily level, but also just entering into age segregated infrastructures such as education. And from that moment on, your supposed well-being or the tracking of who you are and what you should be is in line with this kind of assigned age. And if you're falling off the line of age, you're basically falling out of line. So that's kind of how I approach ageism. So it concerns all of us at any moment. And I start the book with an experience of sexual assaults that I experienced at a very young age. And I do that because I consider it my first introduction to ageism. Because as a white female child or feminized child, I was always told that I was too young for sex, but I had actually already experienced it. So even though the category of the child, the white innocent child, deeply implicated me as being a subject that deserved, quote unquote, that category and the protective measures that come with that category, I felt confronted at a very early age that even that category did not serve what it was set out to do. So the hypocrisy of age and the supposed protection that comes with the idea of childhood didn't work. And this is why I start there. I also, of course, start there because it's a kind of like trick to side with, like, if we're thinking in a kind of dichotomy, like in a kind of opposition between victim and perpetrator, I am writing about questions of age of consent. I am writing about dismantling what the figure of the child means, but not from like an older gay male perspective, which is often, you know, Shuli also has written about this in The Baffler, which is often the perspective that it's been written about in the 70s. And so I kind of take away the munition of the right wing by saying like, oh, but I am a victim and I'm actually speaking from that position of victimhood, even though I personally also dismantle this idea of the victim. But we don't have to get into that right now in a classroom. And so I start with that that experience of sexual assault. And it's always hard to think like where to introduce the book because there's so many different threads. But one of the other threads, I would say, another experience that I start with. So as you can see, I'm writing a lot from this kind of embodied experience into theory, right? Another experience that I'm writing with is intergenerational relationshipping and intergenerational intimacies. So I write with experiences of having partners who are multiple years older and how we are being approached and the kind of projection of family that is put upon us. So when I'm out with my partner is being addressed as my parent. And then this question comes up like, okay, should we refuse that and say like, no, we're just we're lovers actually, which is great. We can come out as that. Or should we say like, indeed, and then kiss in front of them and leave the kind of atmosphere of like, oh yeah, maybe, okay, you're French kissing, to say it like that, with your parent, okay? So it's also these questions of like defensive strategies comes forward a lot in Against Ageism. It's like, if we are called as trans people, if we are called groomers, should we say no, we are not? Or can we find a way of saying like, yes, indeed, very contagious. This is actually really contagious. So those are some ways into the book. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, both of these things are obviously provocations because, you know, there's obviously right now an obsession over children and the potential queerness of children. And then there's also a lot about age gaps in relationships, the possibility of consent when there's an age gap. And these things are connected because I think a lot of our culture is like so hyper-focused on pedophilia, right? And this comes from a certain kind of history, like a moral panic that was like basically, it was created by the right wing, right? We don't necessarily need to go into that history, but and along with also, like you were saying, with an older lover, there it brings up the other huge taboo of incest, right? That like people are made uncomfortable by these things. One of the things that I'm interested in terms of the story that you tell in the beginning about your sexual assault experience is like, yeah, you speak from the position of someone who was harmed, but you also find you talk about how it is part of how you understand yourself, how you understand your gender and your sexuality. So you're not completely disavowing it, right? And when I mean, you know, like people get into complex thinking about this, but in public you're supposed to just be like, you know, this was bad and there's nothing about it that matters to me except for the harm, you know, especially in a kind of punitive society that we live in. But one of the things that like I think could also trouble queers within that is like this idea of what makes you queer, right? Which is also what troubles the right wing, particularly right now around trans people, right? Like how that they're scared that their children are changing genders, right? And where that will go. First, you know, just like using different pronouns, but they're you know particularly scared about hormones and surgeries, obviously. And this definitely revolves also around reproduction and making more babies. So I'm curious about this idea of like making queer. Like, yeah, maybe grooming isn't the word we want to use, but there's like a seduction into queerness that can happen. And historically, it has happened across different ages, and we're in a time period where that is not acceptable. And when we look back in the past, right, like. I've translated and studied this French gay liberationist and theorist, Guy Ockinghem, and he was he had his first sexual relationship with a teacher when he was in high school. And then they went on to collaborate for the rest of Guy's life. So, you know, he maintained a relationship, not a sexual relationship, but a relationship with this person who we would condemn, right? And I think, like, honoring Guy's point of view, like, we have to say, like, he chose to be in relationship with this person, right? When I've written about that, I had someone email me and tell me that like Guy Ockinghem had some kind of like Stockholm syndrome because he was harmed, and then like we can't believe what he says about this stuff, which I was like, that really pissed me off. Anyway, the two of them actually, I brought them up in this provocative way, but the two of them think about this idea of the system of childhood. I'm trying to bring this back around. The system of childhood, right? That childhood isn't a natural category, just like gender or sexuality isn't natural, and it does something for our culture, and it has something to do with power, right? And one of the fears I think that creates the system of childhood as a structure of power and hierarchy, that innocence that allows the adults to like have their position in the world, is the potential queerness of the child, right? The child being in this kind of queer position. So to put this back to you, I don't know. Yeah, what do you, I mean, you know, you're getting into a story of like gendering, like age is gendered and like maybe age is queer. Like I'm curious about your thoughts on this idea of like becoming queer. And as Ockinghem said, he's like, we maybe were born gay, but we choose to stay gay, which is like another interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, well, there's so much there in what you say. I think, thank you for that. I mean, on the one hand, if we don't call it grooming, but we call it being in relationship, like a form of contagion that happens through being surrounded, I think it's about, and you also write about this in the Baffler piece, right? Like the way in which we are conditioned into believing this kind of contained subject. And the contained subject then goes along with the property lines that you're drawing in relationship to the nuclear family. So I think for me, what feels really important about being against ageism is that age in many ways upholds the nuclear family. Age in many ways upholds what capitalism does. So, for example, the way in which the figure of the child is comes up in at least the lineage that I draw is through the age of industrialization. So it's this kind of protective measure of children so that they do not have to labor, right? They don't have to work. Now, of course, my argument would not be that they should be working. It's more that I'm flipping it around and asking, so why is it that when you turn 18, suddenly it's okay for you to be exploited by the workforce? So if we feel that there are certain qualities that we can protect or that we should be protecting before a particular age, why do they not apply to quote unquote adults? Right, so that's one of the ways that I'm thinking about this. But to also come back to what you were saying and the question of contained, the way that I'm reading this experience of sexual assault, not just as something bad that happened, is because if I would just say like this was bad and it happened to me, then that makes the event of the assault a containable event, a happening that I can point to and that is outside of myself, which then reaffirms this idea that I am some sort of contained subject that was penetrated and didn't deserve to be penetrated. And I mean penetrated in a much more broader sense than, sorry, maybe this is not the right word choice in this context, that I have absorbed, instead of thinking I have absorbed this experience, I have swirled with this. I have intimacy and proximity with this experience. I am supposed to say that I am outside of this experience and I wish it didn't happen to me. But everything that I'm speaking right now is speaking also with that experience. Not in an essentializing way. It's not that what defines me, but I have become with it. And so I'm thinking through kind of like disability studies, crip theory. I'm thinking, for example, about Mel White Chen's work, Animacies, where they're writing from the position of having been entered, right, by toxins that have created a particular disability. And instead of saying like, okay, yes, we can point to the harm, as you say, we can point to the harm that was done because it was like a military dumping of toxins. We can point to that and say that was wrong. And still, I have already become with the toxins. So I cannot separate myself from what has entered me already. If I were to do that, that would be a false sort of interpretation of subjectivity. So that's one way I'm thinking about gender as well, right? And another way that I'm reading this experience, you know, not to like hinge everything on this assault experience, but is to allow for a kind of trans reading, and to say like, okay, but even we don't need to know what was true, but if I say that I'm experiencing a kind of, for lack of a better word, agency over the desire that I think I may have felt as well, then that agency was maybe a first play or tinkering around with what we would call masculinity. Because to have that kind of agency over a desire and to be able to say I have desire is in like an oppositional dichotomous framework attached to masculinity. So instead of pathologizing it into a Stockholm syndrome, I'm saying like, maybe there was a drag performance there at 6 years old. Doesn't mean it has to be, that's not the end of the narrative, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about here is like, there's this desire always to find like the cause of something, especially when it's something that you feel is, or when not us maybe, but like society thinks is wrong, right? And so I was also thinking when you first started talking about children, they're like tracked from an ableist perspective, right? And then if you, you know, in the nuclear family is a laboratory and hierarchy, and it's supposed to produce straight children, right, who will reproduce the family. And so if something goes off, if your kid is gay or trans, like you want to know why, right? And there's a convenience in saying, oh, it's because sexual assault, right? Or it's because this or that. They read a book or whatever, right? You know, that attempt to like find a cause is also the same kind of attempt to find a pure outside of things, right? Like you're talking about Mel Y. Chen, like we can't live pure lives completely separated from the environment that we're in. So then we're in this moment, and like how do we deal with that? If something happens to you that's harmful, you can, you know, I mean, this is something that I have chronic illness, right? And whenever if I have a flare, I'm like, what did I do to cause that? But like, I have to let myself off the hook and be like, I didn't cause this. So, I mean, okay, so taking this back also to children, well, I don't know, I'm thinking about how we're so afraid of children's sexuality, right? And part of the attempt to control children is to control their relationship with their own bodies. And when I say children's sexuality, I'm not saying children having sex, right, in any particular way, but that children have pleasure within their bodies. And that's like a thing that's under surveillance within the family structure. I don't know, yeah, I mean, like maybe we can talk more about childhood, but like you're also concerned with aging beyond that, and I'm wondering if you find parallels in the way that children are sort of contained and treated, and then the way that we look at older people, right? Like, because the other side, there's like you give all this Aristotle theory about age, where like young people are like this, and then you're in the prime of age, and then you're in the decline or whatever.
Yeah, sorry, I got enthusiastic, and then you just hear me breathe like really loud into the microphone. I was thinking, so the Aristotle, you know, for those who are maybe thinking about getting the book, it's on the first floor, the ground floor. But it's okay. That was like I was trying to sell it, but I was gonna say. It's only 2 or 3 pages of Aristotle, so you don't have to worry about that. Don't worry about it. But what is so fascinating about that, I mean, there were some things that you were saying about cause that I want to come back to, but what's so fascinating about the Aristotle is that, so he's talking about the characteristics of the young those in their prime and the old. And the characteristics that he describes are so incredibly stereotypical that it reads like a comic or like a comedy. And simultaneously, you just see how those stereotypes have filtered into what we consider. So like, okay, the young are always energetic. So then, of course, we see already a kind of ableism rise, right? Like, what about the idea that not everybody has the same embodiment at a young age, right? So it's this expectation that if you're young, you're energetic, and you're running on hot air, I think he's calling it. And there's also examples, I think I refer to this in the book in a footnote, for example, where you would see that over time, the stereotypes that stick to testosterone are so different at any moment. It just depends what is the most utilitarian, so the most useful stereotype at that moment. So at some point, it might be masculinizing, and masculinization in a context of incarceration has a kind of calming effect. So you see that the way the development of testosterone is experimented on imprisoned people in St. Quentin in California. And they use testosterone to quote unquote masculinize in order to calm incarcerated folks, because the demasculinization of incarceration must somehow be countered. And then I look at, for example, narratives in the Netherlands right now. You would have this quote of testosterone bombs, like bombs of testosterone, which is a deeply racialized term, mostly used for Dutch Moroccan youth. And it's this idea that crime comes from testosterone, right? But I'm mentioning testosterone because it also relates very much to ideas of aging. And I'm coming back to Aristotle, which is that you can just see how Aristotle also produced these kind of stereotypes that are helpful for a particular moment and that are politically useful. So what is really interesting, for example, is that he says that the age, the characteristics of those in their prime are mentally, one is in their prime. I should probably say him. He is in his prime when 49. And Aristotle writes this text when he is 49. So you can see how age is utilized. And I think that also brings me to the cause, because I'm also addressing these questions on a very sort of like basic level, which is like, can we just cut out the language that we use, that language that is age-based, in order to have excuses? So, for example, which is where the cause comes in, right? It's like, oh, you use age as a cause, but it's not. So like, oh, I'm going home, even though the party is still going. Yeah, well, I'm old. So this way of referring to oneself or referring to particular behavior through age, I'm just wondering, like, what would happen to our kind of relating if we didn't use age as an excuse? And I think another example, and then I'll stop, but is, since you brought in, like, thinking about the older, is in the chapter Fuck Your Racist Grandma. And you see a kind of overlap between the infantilization of the grandma, right, which is also gendered, which you also brought in.
Right, yeah.
And to say like, oh, well, she's old, so she just doesn't know better. Which, of course, we should always counter with like, okay, what is the access here, or what is the expected access here of information, or the proximity to particular resources? So there's this infantilization, but I'm less concerned about the infantilization in this moment of the racist grandma, and more about the assumption that the grandchild will be less racist somehow, just inevitably because of the passing of time. And that, of course, promotes this idea that there's such a thing as linear progressive time, where things in the past are inevitably more conservative, and in the present would be more progressive, and in the future even more progressive. And I think you've also, you talked about this in relationship to like organizing circles and like the kind of projections onto both youth and elders, right? Maybe you want to...
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's like a lazy politics to say like, oh, when all the old racist people die off, then we'll be in like some kind of free world. And like I have my students are always like, whoa, it's so bad back then and it's so good right now. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's good right now. But yeah, like like anarchists aren't. I'm an anarchist. Anarchists aren't immune to this issue because most organizing spaces are adult-based. They're probably mostly dominated by 20s, 30s, right? Like there's a knowledge that people like age out of organizing because there's not really if people have kids, for example, there's no room for kids in a space of organizing or like work or health stuff, right? Like as you get older, if you're dealing with like illness, like there's not as much access. And I think that's interesting. So like when I talk about a political commitment to something like family abolition and youth liberation, I think it's connected to also how we would like organize space, right? Because like family abolition, as Sophie Lewis says, it's like about the deprivatization of care, right? And youth liberation is to like get youth the ability to determine their lives, right? Rather than to be property, which is how people think of children. But so what that would mean, right, is if we deprivatize care and communalize or collectivize care, then the age of a person at any moment wouldn't be the determinant of whether they need care, right? It would be your need, right? And then the ability to for people to show up and do that. And then, yeah, I think like there's this default idea that like the young will bring in new ideas, right, and the old are kind of jaded, and to a certain extent that like when we have these stereotypes, people take them on for sure. And there is some truth probably to the fact that like someone who hasn't been slammed down by the cops a bunch of times like has some different idea, or like what I think about with my students who like go out into the streets. I'm like, now they see firsthand that the police aren't there to protect them, so you like have an object lesson of that. But I think a lot of those cliches are ways to block the possibility of like people speaking or collaborating too, actually. And I want to tie this to one of the concerns of your book, which is temporality, because and like time, because we have the progress narrative, which is also like the idea that you go from one place, like you grow up. You were talking about like work, the age of work, right? Like one of the things that defines adulthood is needing to work, right? And if we come from a like, I don't want work to exist. I don't want there to be capitalist work, which means that if we didn't have work, children and adults would be collaborating in a different way, right? Like you wouldn't necessarily need to lock children up in school so that they don't destroy the world, and to enable adults to like work exploitative jobs. So like, yeah, freeing up that, I can imagine freeing up different timelines. What else? There was one other thing I wanted to say, which is like your internal experience of aging is usually like a kind of a dissonance, because I feel the same, right, as I've always felt, right? And like I feel the same as I was like when I was in my teens or 20s, and I'm carrying all of these memories and like experiences of my childhood. So there's like a persistence there, or even like a parallel of different timelines. And it's only like the external world that really reflects back to you your experience of aging, whether that's like through stereotypes, sometimes maybe it's through illness as well. Yeah, but maybe we can get into some of the time stuff, because it's something I'm excited. Maybe this talk, I don't know, I feel like we're like touching points that I all of them I would love to dig deeper in, and maybe there'll be questions, but I wanted to open up time.
Great. How are you doing? Yeah. How are you feeling your time? You're good? Yeah? Okay. I want to, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Before we open up time? Because when you said that about the need for care, I was thinking, so one of the things I always struggle with in relationship to this book is that there's often a lot of educators that come to the talk, and then they say like, well, I really agree, and I want to give this is the thing, I want to give children agency, but like they're working in systems that are age segregated, where they are the teacher and they are perceived to be the authority based on their age and their experience, which, you know, is also interesting to me about, like, you know, being slammed by the cops. Like, yes, there's a question of accumulation of experience, and there's a way in which we can attest to accumulating experience, just as that most age is equated to accumulating wealth. So for a particular middle class white subject, there's this idea that you would accumulate stability and wealth over time. And if you don't, then you basically never age, or you're doing something completely wrong, right? So there's also these qualities around age in terms of, like, calming down, not coming to particular spaces anymore, not being in organizing anymore, because you just compare, you're not supposed to need it anymore to be in this, like, mutual aid situation. Or, but it made me wonder. So I cite this poem in the book that's called The Johnny Cake. It's by Cheryl Clark, and in it there's a speaker, narrator, who goes to a funeral, a wake, and they explicitly say, like, I have no experience with grief, and therefore they're learning a lot, and they have these interactions with the aunties who have obviously a lot more experience, but the obvious a lot more experience is not because they are narrated as older. It's just because they have experience, and the narrator does not. And then there's something sexual that happens. It's like goes from kneading dough to something else. Great. And for me, the poem resonates a possibility of knowledge transference that is not based on, like, the authority of age, but on the idea, like, that you can come in and say, like, I do not know anything about this. What do you know? Mm-hmm. And when you were speaking about care, and, like, care being need-based instead of categorically distributed, I was wondering if you, from all of your experience also in youth liberation, how you respond to questions around education.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, so I make some of my money teaching, and I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. And like you said, the age segregated space with, like, grades, which is also an invention, right? It's not like the natural way to teach. It's a Western invention going back to religious orders. But that space is created with, like, a master. That was, like, what they were called, right? And so, you know, as an anti-authoritarian and going into a classroom, there's almost no way to completely counteract the position of the teacher being imbued with some kind of authority. So, like, you have to acknowledge that, right? Because that exists. I can't just go into a classroom, and students aren't going to be, like, because they're so, I mean, school, like family, is training you to follow rules, right? And so, like, you lose your capability of invention and possibilities. So when I'm teaching and I try to make a horizontal thing where I'm, like, inviting students to collaborate with me on, like, making assignments and grading, or I don't really grade, but anyway, they don't know what to do often, right? Yeah. They want me to do it for them. They want to be told that they're good or bad, and they want me to give them the assignment and tell them how to do things, which I find really interesting. I mean, there's obviously alternative education spaces, and I've taught in those where people have more self-directed learning, but, like, just mostly it's like that. So I try to find ways to counteract it, but I also don't believe that, like, the institutions in which I teach are possible spaces of liberation. So I do what I can within them. And, you know, I was thinking, though, because, like, so we have death on one side, which we so much of our society is organized around disavowing, right? And then also, like, invisibilizing, right? Like, this person could go to a wake and be like, I don't have any experience with death, right? And, like, people have written about how we've, like, in, like, Western European culture, progressively, like, hidden away bodies. There's this other thing, though, I was thinking about with, like, children. Human babies are born in a complete helplessness, right? Like that is actually true. Like if you just left a newborn to like care for themselves, they would die, right? They need care, and longer than a lot of other animals, right? Like for more years, right? Which I think is, we can like naturalize that in a way that creates this kind of progression. Why did I want to go there? I was just thinking that like kind of prematurity of birth is one way to say it. How much of that determines the ways that we think about life, about aging, about like the need for authority, the need for someone to have complete control over your body, for example. I'm curious if you've thought about that.
Wow. No, I mean, it's funny because it brings me back to what we started talking about in relationship to the cause of gender in some ways. Is this, I mean, you know, I love playing, as I then outed early on, with the sort of incestuous realm of being perceived parent and child. But it also relates to this question of like, why do we put so much of our explaining around like how a person came to be around the family? Right, and there's a lot of sort of like interpersonal psychological explanation that around like those early years, especially now that queers have taken up polysecure and like are all into the attachment theory, which I could talk about for a while, but I will refrain from for now. And so like this kind of this focus on attachment and where attachment happens simultaneously while leaving the nuclear family intact. So it brings me kind of there. It also brought me somewhere else, but I don't think we should go there. Which I'm trying not to like roll back in.
Sounds so interesting though.
The problem is that I don't think it was like no, but it brings, okay, I'll just tell you now that because it's now you all think it's really interesting, so I should probably not tell you because then it's more interesting. The force of opacity. I was at the barber earlier today, and we were having a conversation, and he was like broing me up like full on, and I was like trying to go along with it for a while. And at some point, he's telling me that him and his girlfriend are in an open relationship, and I'm like, okay, cool. And so, at some point, he says to me, picking up on the fact that I'm too gay for this conversation, and he's like, yeah, well, you know, in the straight world there's just not that much, you know, open relationshiping. And I was like, no, that's true, I very much applaud that you two are doing this. And then he said something, yeah, well, I think it's biology that there's not that many straight couples that are doing an open relationship. And so in this moment I was like, okay, now I have a problem because I'm gonna have to engage this conversation full on. Yeah. And I'm going to have to come out as trans, because he was just kind of like broing me up, and I was like, oh yeah, women are so different. And I was like, why did I get there? Because of the idea of the premature.
But biology, yeah.
Yeah, with the biology. And he was just like, you know, it was, in the end, it was like an hour and a half conversation that I didn't know for sure if I wanted to have, but it was interesting to talk to him about this sort of like desire to explain through biology.
Yeah.
And I was trying to get not just at like, I don't think that's true because I have been trained in feminist theory, and feminist theory is like questioning at least all these biological truths. Like that wasn't the interesting route for this conversation, right? So I was trying to figure out what it was through attachment actually that helped him feel a particular way of good in relationship to these kind of biological narratives.
Yeah, well, this will get us to the breakup, but let me just comment first. Wow, you got stuck in an hour and a half long conversation teaching something to a straight man? That's really weird. Yeah, okay, so, right, like I'm really interested in refusal, right? And like, so let's say biology was like, is destiny, right? Like, which is something that we don't want to say, but like, even if it was, we should be able to say no, right? And this is also the fear about trans people, is that like trans people can engineer bodies, change the body, refuse the biology, like change sex, right? Which is something that we're supposed to be stable. Bringing this into relationships, like I think refusal is a really important way to think about the possibility of relationship. Like, even if you don't break up with someone, the knowledge that you can break up is really important, because so many people get stuck in things. You know, for me, that doesn't mean like a straight couple should open up their relationship, because, you know, there's a lot of examples of that not being liberating, at least for the woman, you know. But I do.
According to him, would be biology.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's like, because it's usually like, oh yeah, because like, and this is very old. Like, well, men need to go fuck around, and women don't really need to fuck around, right? Like, so I needed to be open so that I can actually, you know, be with her, and like let off the steam, as Aristotle would say, the hot air. Why? You know, so like, this is again a temporality question. We are so trained to think in like eternals and things. We value the things that last longer. Like, I've been in this job for like 30 years, and I've been married for 50 years, and you know, actually, like, we can free ourselves from that and think things have different rhythms. They have different timelines, and part of that is like part of our kind of taking that on is refusing things that we don't want or we don't need, right? That don't help us. Like, you know, get rid of that friend that you have from childhood that like you don't want to talk to all the time, but you feel like you're obligated to because they have some claim on your youth, you know? So yeah, you were talking about divestment, and I wonder if there's a linking between this, my emphasis on refusal, and like the way that you're trying to think about divestment.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Can I make a little detour back to what you were saying?
You go wherever you want. Sorry, I was just like turning that over.
No, I'm seeing a no in the back.
But
I'm refusing. Well, so the Johnny Cake poem that I mentioned about the funeral wake was gifted to me by a lover who was a different lover who is also multiple decades older than I am, and I remember she gave me this poem, and she was very scared that the proximity in her life to loss, like there were a lot of people in her life that were dying and or had died or had been lost in life, and she really felt like she was afraid that it wasn't sexy, this like presence of loss in her life, because of my age. And I don't know if I could convince, but for me, I was like, no, it's actually really sexy to me. I don't know, that sounds a bit strange maybe, but I was like, this is not a problem at all. It's actually quite invigorating. And so that's something that came up for me when you were talking about this kind of temporality, right? Like the over-appreciation of a particular kind of longevity, and then the longevity is also seen as the ethical standpoint. So also in organizing, right, this idea is like, oh, if you set something up, if you set up a group, or if you start a podcast, that the success of that podcast or the success of that group is measured by how long it exists. And that also brings me back to, like, I wrote a piece for Trans Studies Quarterly that's called Frivolous as Frivolous as Fashion, and that's also about like this kind of like it's tying disability and transness together. So like if we can think about transness being frivolous, and that doesn't mean necessarily the same as it being performative, but it means that it doesn't have to prove its existence through longevity or through sustenance or through maintenance in some sense, but you could indeed have a frivolous relationship to transness. It doesn't have to be something deep and internal that somehow was already always there, right? Right.
Transness is like, when it's accepted, is expected to have a timeline and a progression. And one of the things I'm really interested in is like if we can like take control of transition, you know, like doing hormones yourself, for example, then the timeline of transition can be many different things, right? And like in this world where we're defending ourselves against people trying to take away trans care, there's this like phenomenon of the detransitioner who's like, you know, basically then joins the right wing and is like, oh, I was duped. But like, imagine a world where you could You could go to this is what I always think, you go to a punk show and you pick up some estrogen, right? And you're like, oh, I want to try this estrogen. And you're like, do that for a little while. And then you're like, I don't want it, whatever, right? Like, we wouldn't have to necessarily like freeze ourselves in an identity. And that's not to say that there are people who shouldn't do things in any way. It's just like, I think it's interesting to imagine different possibilities of transition. And the thing with the partner too, I was just thinking about is like death, childhood, that creates different possibilities of care, and care has possibilities of intimacy, and intimacy always has some possibility of like pleasure, right? It doesn't need to be like having sex or something like that, but like touching. And so if someone is going through a lot of hard times, or someone needs care from illness, we think that is disgusting or just drives people away, but it does open up space for another kind of intimacy.
Yeah, and I think, no, I'm going to wrap this into divestment, because you did pose that question.
Yes.
And then one of the ways that I'm trying to think about divestment is more in relationship to a new book that I'm writing on trans despair. And I'm thinking with the work of Avgi Tsakatopoulou, who's a psychoanalyst based in New York, wrote Sexuality Beyond Consent and Gender Without Identity. And she's writing about exigent sadism. I won't go into too many details, but she's thinking about it in relationship to the BDS movement, right? So she's thinking like, okay, what does it mean to refuse sitting at the table? So if Columbia University says like, oh, you can come and negotiate with us, and you, instead of saying like, oh yes, thank you very much, we are going to come and show up, you just refuse shaking the hand of the person in authority, right? And so it's this kind of divestment. She's thinking with a concept of passability, which is a passing between action and inaction. And there's a kind of pleasure in the inaction of refusal. And since you mentioned refusal, I thought it would be interesting to loop this in. And I'm thinking about transness also in relationship to this passability. So that it's not because of how it needs to be defended in the current moment, we need to continuously put it in a position of action to say like, no, but I am so deeply trans that I deserve to be trans.
Right.
Transness does something to the gender binary. So like non-binary, also like the reason for non-binary to be allowed to exist is that it dismantles the gender binary. Well, maybe it just doesn't do anything. And so it's this kind of, and simultaneously there's also this surrender to, indeed, like taking estrogen after a punk show and not knowing what will happen. So it's not always the action of like deciding that you want particular changes, but surrendering to the changes. And I'm thinking about divestment in this context also of defense, right? Like what kind of existences are possible if we are not called into a defensive mode?
Right. I was just thinking that the sort of unspoken thing and everything for me is psychoanalysis, which we don't need to get into. And I could also just go off about encampments and the campus organizing, but I think the way you said it is right. Like as soon as they get you to the table about divestment, you've lost. Yeah. There's like, people talk about who talked about it? Is like Gayatri Spivak, like a strategic essentialism like that we need to use, and I don't know that I like agree with that, because I think when we're talking about trans politics, when we fight them on their terrain, we lose, right? Like maybe we do need to have legal battles to protect care, but that's only defending, right? A war of attrition, right? And anything that we get from the state could be taken away. So it's like building these unseen networks where we can do other things, which, the history of transition or transness is people helping each other in mutual aid, stealing, navigating institutions that are meant to kill them in order to make transition possible. And that's a history that I think we can draw on and sort of refuse the liberal politics that we think are the more realistic ones, and that gets, like if we do the people who organize their politics about defense also get shitty to other trans people because they're like, we need to maintain this line and this is how it is. Like you were saying about non-binary, like non-binary is very threatening to certain trans people who think that the idea of non-binary is going to take away trans care. And I understand where that comes from, but yeah. Where was I going with that? Yeah, I mean, I guess like I connect this idea of like refusal and with also like refusing to be seen. You know, I don't mean like going stealth or something. It's some version of that, right? Like navigating the world in a way that works for you rather than what we think we're supposed to do. Yeah. It's interesting. We're both working on despair too. Yeah, it happened. We found out at the same time, and I do think like these negative things are actually like refusal is actually a creative force because it opens up space for things that we don't know, right? And that's something I think is true for any kind of transition. Is even if you know what you want to be, right? There's a moment of like leaping into the unknown, right? When you first like inject a hormone, for example, because everyone's body does different things, right? And so, yeah, that possibility of creating a space for an opening for the unknown, I think it's destructive and creative at the same time.
To be very linear.
Yes.
We have a few more minutes before we're getting kicked out of the classroom, which is very, fitting to the context. Should we... Yeah, should we take some questions before we go, or can we? Or should we?
Yes, if there are.
If there are, yeah.
So I wanted to go first. I came in randomly because I didn't know what the talk was about. I took so many notes because I think you guys are very verbose in your understanding of ageism, and it reflects in the way that you explain your personal story. My background is I've been atmosphere for a long time, but what I keep on seeing is like the difference between like willful ignorance and like recognition and like responsibility for recognizing when something's happening. And like you can tell like through different like lenses people I see gender differently, age differently, and specifically age I feel is the biggest like contrast. Like you shared because one thing you pointed out was childhood as like a false system, and I never thought of that. But I also want to think about like rich cultural histories and how like everybody's culture, in a sense, is part of the system being funneled into like to both your points that referred to like the American wage system. But I just wanted to ask. What culture? I'm not familiar with your from. You have an accent, but what culture do you think, like, if any, like, shine a light on the correct way that?
So there's a question. I'm going to try to summarize a little bit. Like you were talking about like willful ignorance versus recognition, and from your experience in like advocacy work, and then thinking about like, as we critique these different kinds of systems, there's also cultural history that's involved with them. So like this, not a simple negation of that. And you wanted to know about Simon's own cultural backgrounds, or like what kinds of cultures you think might be helpful.
Yeah. Well, it's not the culture where I'm from, because I'm from the Netherlands, which basically, is the foundation of this Wall Street capitalism and slavery in this country. So that's very unfortunate. But I do talk in the book about sort of the universalization of white aging. So like just in terms of like the portrayal of aging, like what sort of images of aging come forward first when thought about aging, and of course like the centralization of the idea of the child being protected, but that only being for the white child or being for the European child. And so I mostly talk about this in a dismantling aspect. I bring forward from the US context Black quantum futurism and their thinking with quantum physics. However, I purposefully do not draw in exterior or outside outside for me, from my indeed Dutch and American cultural context, outside interpretations of time, and there are of course many, right? There's so many interpretations of time that are not linear or that do not see the future forward, but like look at time as looking at the past, like the past is ahead of you, right? There's of course all these conceptions and lived conceptions of circular time, and the reason that I'm not bringing it in this very tiny book is not because I wanted to give Aristotle some space, but is because I am trying to really write from embodied experience, and embodied experience includes like the kind of absorption and like proximity and entanglement with theory as well, but not. I'm just really trying to avoid a kind of anthropological extraction. Like I wouldn't trust myself bringing in a kind of example from an experience of time that is so not lived by myself that I could only bring it in as an example, as a way out. And maybe this. Sorry, that was a very long-winded to get there, but like I think it really relates to what we were saying about this kind of negativity, right? That it's not to not use particular ways of looking at time as a way out of our shitty problem of using linear time in relationship to aging. And so what I try to do is stay with I was only gonna say stay with the trouble.
Stay with the trouble.
Stay with the trouble. No, but stay with the. I think we can stay a little longer. For me, I'm saying we, but I don't know who the we is in this case. I can stay a little longer with the mess that we are in, instead of bringing forward examples that would maybe get us out of the mess that we are in.
Yeah, I think this is a super important question, and the European culture created things like race and gender that as we live them, right? And if we think of those as negative things that we want to abolish, we have to also understand that within the imposition of these hierarchies and violence, there's also a positive experience, right, of culture. And so if you were like to say like let's abolish race, you wouldn't want to abolish a culture that was created within a space of domination, right? And it's the same thing with like gender, sexuality. And just to give a historical example from that, like Guy Ockenham, who's a gay liberationist, was sort of like, after like we sort of won some things, he was like, actually it was better when gay was criminalized and like, cruising was this like illegal thing that we did. I mean, cruising is still, but like there's this thing that gets lost when you like get something accepted in a way, and I think that's a really interesting thing to sit with, to say like in a space where homosexuality is criminalized and you have to hide yourself and act in these different ways because you don't want to get caught, there's a culture that's formed there that you don't want to just throw away, right? And so this progress narrative of like being accepted actually means losing something that's kind of definitional for your experience. So I don't know if that for me, that's what your question brought out. And I think it's like very hard. There's no solution to it. But the thing is that, like you were saying, we're in a mess. We can't go to before the mess. So we decide what we bring along with us, right? And what we let go of.
I'm seeing that we have to wrap up. Let's take it outside. Thank you so much, Shuli, for being in this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah.
Buy this book, read it.
Yeah, and also Shuli has stickers of the Breakup Theory podcast. Listen to the podcast, and there's a few books. Yes, and come talk to us, maybe outside.
I'll be outside.
Yeah. Thank you so much.